How many times have you heard someone proclaim that a game has deep gameplay? If you follow games discussion as much as I do, then probably a lot. The problem is, this is rarely given any explanation. Despite how most people would say that gameplay is paramount in a title, this vague descriptor isn't often elaborated on. In games critique, gameplay is often labelled under good or bad, deep or shallow, pretty meaningless distinctions with little regard for how all its elements interact with one another in the service of the whole product. Today I want to talk about the concept of depth in a game's design, because I feel like it isn't mentioned as much as it should be. At least, not properly. But what's finicky about this is that everyone seems to have a different definition of what this actually means. Some might say it's the amount of moves available in a combat system or just how open-ended a game is. I'd say that depth is the ability for the player to make meaningful decisions relating to the core mechanics of the title. It's the amount of non-redundant states in a game that are relevant to the person playing, allowing there to be a clear divide between the play of low and higher skill players. Now, this is a big topic, so I'd like to start by talking about one of the fundamental principles of making a game more deep. Let's say you have a platformer with two basic functions, run and jump. The jump has a fixed arc to it, so at no point in midair can you change your direction of movement. Now imagine you can double jump at any point during that initial jump arc. You could jump at the very top of the arc to get the maximum height possible in ascending, you could jump at the very end of an arc as you start to drop below where you started for maximum distance in crossing gaps, or you can jump back to save yourself from an incorrect jump. Used in tandem with appropriate obstacles, this small addition should increase the range of possibilities when jumping, adding to the depth of the game. This is where simple platformers get their depth, not through their number of moves, nor mechanics, nor ways of jumping, even double jumping, but more through the way their few mechanics create a range of possibilities for bypassing obstacles. Depth can further be increased by creating interaction between mechanics. In Super Mario Bros., running, jumping, and changing direction all have impacts on each other. Your maximum jump height in Mario is increased when jumping from your top ground speed, and your direction can be altered in mid-air to a certain extent depending on how much inertia there is. This means that players not only need to carefully gauge their jump heights or positions, but also their speed in enabling them to jump higher. Between these mechanics there is a wider range of possibilities than any one alone. The key here is that these mechanics have synergy with each other. Even without the direct influence of run speed on jump height, the two are used in combination to bypass obstacles and affect each other through their control of horizontal and vertical positions relative to the stage. In classic Sonic games, for example, the player has to think about the best way to maintain their speed. They can jump at the right time to bounce off an enemy for added height or roll into a ball to gain speed downhill. Those who consider all the options they have open to them are able to play a more varied, fast-paced and consequently fun game. Typically, this is what a game aspires to achieve. You want to give the players subtle nuances that allow them to take advantage of and master different ways to use even a simple set of mechanics, and moreover make this fun to do.
Lock and load.
Vanquish may not be the most deep or complex of Platinum's works, yet it still stands as tribute to this sentiment. At its heart, Vanquish tries to present itself as a cool, speedy third-person shooter, evident in the boost being one of the main mechanics. There may be a few dull, slower moments in the game, but for the most part it wants you to go fast, shoot crap, and look sick while doing it. Now, you can play by the rules and just use the boost to get from one place to another. Occasionally pop out of cover to take a few hits at an enemy, then crouch back down and wonder why you're not going as fast as that sweet holographic cover would have you believe. I mean, you can play like this, it's fine, you can get the job done, but with more effort and skill, there's much more to be gained from the system. Considering how Vanquish is about going fast, first order of business is to try and cut out as much downtime as possible. The main way of going about this is with the use of boost dodging. The way boosting in Vanquish works is that it slowly depletes your gauge, which in turn makes your dodging slower, stops you boosting, using melee attacks or going slow motion. However, this doesn't actually start depleting for a good third of a second after you initiate it, so with proper timing you can cancel your boost with a roll and there you go. You get a fair bit more distance than a standard roll and you don't deplete your boost gauge in the process. This is so good not just because it makes dispatching enemies more efficient, but skilled players are rewarded with a much more frantic and fun battle scenario. It's not a treasure trove of depth and strategy, but it provides a very clear distinction between those with the balls to get right into the thick of things and those whose backs appear to have melded with the set dressing. Vanquish's core principles are that of speedy shooting, keeping momentum, and gruff voices, so it's good that the game rewards those who put just a little more thought into how they play with this stuff. Well, except for the gruff voices thing, that just sort of comes with the cigarettes. As has been said, Vanquish is not even the most complex of Platinum's titles. It merely shows a very clear divide between how skilled and unskilled players can play the game in very different ways. Something a lot more technical from the folks at Platinum would be Bayonetta, which is why it's odd to see Bayonetta 2 actually narrow the skill divide by removing or changing some features that encompassed high-level play in the original. Extending witch time by attacking, launching middleweight enemies outside of witch time, getting hit reducing your magic meter, all absent. Even the combo reduction mechanic where your score reduces if you don't complete combos, which was the primary motivation to play aggressively and practice dodge offset, yeah, that's gone. Hell, even taunt offset decided not to show up. All of these things diminish the incentive to practice the higher techniques of Bayonetta, and mechanics such as the new midweight enemies not being relaunchable with wicked weaves is largely pointless. Unfortunately, it only seems to exist to shrink the once very wide skill divide that gave the game such longevity and gave players an incitement to master all of the title's quirks. Bayonetta 2 is far from a bad game, but it's almost like the sequel is less fun for high-level players because of its lower skill ceiling, yet its better kinesthetics make it more appealing to the casual plebs like myself. It still has a lot more depth than most action games these days, but it's disappointing to see small yet key features of the original neglected like this. At least Umber and Spear Offset is still alive and kicking. There are, of course, games where no such divide exists. The line between high and low skill players blurred to the point of being indistinguishable, where gameplay is effectively as shallow as a paddling pool yet the title still gets praised to the high heavens. It is unfortunate that I have to talk this way about the latest major entry in one of my favourite and certainly one of the most prestigious franchises ever, but of course I refer to The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Any time Skyward Sword's horribly vapid combat is defended, the argument falls back on the notion that the combat is good because you get to swing the sword in the same direction as Link. However, the nature of this directional swinging, and moreover the design of the enemies around it, ensures that the skill ceiling is so low it could be mistaken for the skill floor. In a fashion more akin to a game of Simon Says than any form of strategic swordplay, fights are made into a simple right and wrong affair. There's no deliberation, decision making, any sort of risk versus reward strategy. You either swing in the right direction or you don't, that's it. No reward, whether it be intrinsic or extrinsic, is given to any kind of experimentation or clever thinking. Play by the rules and like it. Worse still, there's no interplay between any of the mechanics. Items are pretty much useless in combat, clunky to the point that utilizing them in conjunction with your sword swings is nigh impossible. Even with a total of 8 directions to swing in, each move is essentially a repurposed version of the last, dealing the same damage and having the same properties. What could have been a combat system of anticipating an opening in just the right place for the right move is binned for a 30-hour game of borderline quicktime events. This kind of incredibly simplistic system negates any desire to experiment, as there is but one correct way to play. The fact that Link swings his sword in the same direction you do doesn't matter because after all, it's a gimmick. It may be an initially fun gimmick, but it remains a gimmick nonetheless and does nothing to extend the depth of what was already admittedly a series with pretty okay at best combat. Players should be rewarded for their experimentation regarding what they do as sensible. One such game was Metal Gear Solid 3, a title with loads of neat little touches that actually made sense within the game's world and set of pre-existing mechanics. Food can go off and subsequently harm you, so it makes sense that giving enemies dodgy food can take them out. The game makes it clear that guards call in for backup when they see you, so some players may figure out that you can permanently disable this by shooting radios. I find Metal Gear Solid 3 to be one of the best examples of experimentation because it's so intuitive. The tricks aren't weird, abstract quirks that you'd need to look up on the internet to figure out. They're informed both by the rules of the game itself and basic common sense. They reward players with some clever thinking by eliminating the possibility for backup enemies or taking guards out in a slightly quieter way than shooting them in the head. Stealth games benefit from a lot of possibility space because they're really about players coming up with solutions for seemingly overwhelming odds. Being able to find that one route or that one perfect gadget they think is best to solve a situation. As of such, the more meaningful stuff you give players to interact with, whether it's through the mechanics the player is given or how open the design of a level is, the better. I say meaningful stuff because something a lot of stealth games suffer from these days is bringing in elements that negate the decision making around stealthy options. The addition of being able to play like a third-person shooter may sound alright on paper, but it can effectively have the same effect as limiting the surrounding options by creating one optimal playstyle for every scenario, making going for a stealth route pretty pointless as the alternative is so much easier. Now, it is a little useless for the player to have a plethora of options and ways to combine them if the game doesn't necessitate that the player learns to master them. One of the most effective ways of doing this is establishing enemies or obstacles, allowing the player to learn ways to overcome these, then chucking them into a scenario where they have to deal with several different types of them at once. This ties in with the concept of depth as it forces the player to engage in some real tough decision making, producing a risk versus reward strategy. It's also not about just throwing a load of new mechanics at the player to make the game more complex, but rather just testing what a player already knows. If in a platformer with mid-air movement, right through to the last levels of the last world, every gap was at the exact distance for the usual walk and jump arc, then the existence of mid-air movement would be rendered largely pointless. The player never has to learn to utilize one of their most basic skills, and thus the amount of decision making they do is reduced. The original Ninja Gaiden on NES was a sadistic little title that loved to chuck stuff at the player. Act 3 is where it started to get particularly savage. Not only does it introduce new enemy types to overcome, but what it does is place enemies with different properties together, or in conjunction with some kind of platforming segment to really test the player's skill. However, I'd say that an even better example of this has to be the Castlevania games, particularly 3. Enemies aren't all just humanoid dudes with similar movement and attack patterns. Most enemy designs operate in very different ways. What this means is that when placed in front of the player together, they force them to more carefully consider their actions. One of my favourite examples of this are the classic Medusa heads. Their strange sine wave movement pattern means that if the player is currently engaged with another enemy or platforming obstacle, they have to keep one eye on the Medusa to try and predict where it will go and the other eye on whatever they're currently dealing with. Though in a game like Mario, the stiff Castlevania jump could be seen as counterproductive to adding depth, the enemy and level design in Castlevania means that the unalterable jump arc adds that extra layer of decision making to combat. You have to initiate it at a time and place that means you won't end up hitting either enemy or go off a ledge. In contrast to the way Skyward Sword limits your options, this creates some actual decision making, whether it's worth risking that jump and hoping you can land that mid-air hit, or opting to take things slowly and carefully. Instead of taking away all options but one and highlighting that one option to the player so much that it can't be missed, the addition of more variables to consider provokes more deliberation into what mechanics should be used and when, so as you can emerge victorious. While Skyward Sword's combat is a puzzle that tells you it's one solution, games with good combat are puzzles that ask the player has some agency in coming up with their own solutions given the options they have. Now, when I sat down to write this video, a lot of the depth I had in mind was that to do with real-time action games. How the player makes a split-second decision informed by the mechanics they've learned so far. In most puzzle games, especially in a series like Layton, there is no one consistent mechanic. Each puzzle differs widely, so there's not exactly a mastery of its mechanics over the course of the title. Usually, each subsequent puzzle will be slightly more difficult, but they won't exactly test the skills previously learned. It's worth considering that perhaps what makes a typical puzzle great isn't necessarily the same as what makes other genres great. Puzzles are largely about figuring out that one solution. With too many alternative options, it becomes much easier to reach that end goal almost by accident. On top of this, each puzzle has depth in and of itself, as the player will have to think carefully about the solution to each problem. But there's no form of consistent or evolving depth across a title like Layton. Ghost Trick sort of came close with its ghost and trick mechanics and the usually consistent objectives of finding a way to the other side of the room or preventing a scenario the player has already seen play out. The player is lightly informed on what tricking each object will do, and failure to complete the puzzle will allow the player to figure out how some different combinations of tricks may work. This is where the interplay in Ghost Trick comes from. Rather than coming from manipulating several mechanics at the same time to pass obstacles, it mostly comes as the game asks that you consider in which order you do things so as to manipulate how you'll be able to move across the rest of the stage. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure there's still only one solution to each puzzle, so for a game that likes to tease your brain, it still doesn't go all the way and allow players to figure out their own solution thanks to its somewhat limited mechanics and number of objects. I find that it also didn't progress its mechanics as much as it could have. It would have been great if as the game went on it added a whole lot more interactable objects to each scene, or even multiple tricks for each object. This may sound like I'm opting to solve the game's problems by just adding more stuff, but because Ghost Trick largely centers around figuring out the order to manipulate the environment, adding more options would increase the room for error and clever alternative routes exponentially, turning a game with novel gameplay and a spectacular story into a real masterpiece. But really, just adding more stuff in and of itself doesn't make a game more deep. You have to think about what the core decision making the player goes through is and find ways to make that more complicated. In an attempt to make games more deep and seemingly complex to the hardcore crowd, it can often be tempting to try and squeeze in as many features as humanly possible. One of the most common practices I see is adding superfluous XP and leveling systems to something which doesn't really warrant it at all. Ori and the Blind Forest comes to mind as a prime example. In Ori, the player collects EXP orbs that cause the player to gain levels, which in turn can be fed into an ability tree for upgrades. The problem with this is that nearly all of the ability tree upgrades are statistical bonuses to existing skills that may offer slight advantages to players that purchase them, but rarely alter the way in which the player actually plays the game. On the surface, such a system does grant players unique paths they can take with their character, but there's rarely anything that really shakes the core interaction up. Practically the entire offensive tree is dedicated to upgrades to combat abilities without granting Ori any new moves or techniques to use in combat. Likewise, a triple jump ability which can be unlocked in the tree isn't a major factor in gameplay outside of breaking the platforming challenges. This is an entire sector of the game's design that is distant from the rest of Ori's mechanics. It just feels tacked on, some sort of attempt at increasing the depth of the game without actually considering how much of an impact these things had. Ori could still have done upgrades in another fashion, make all of them mandatory and actually add something to the interplay of the game, like some of them are. Then you could expand further on the platforming and enemy design later in the game with the knowledge that the player has more options to consider. Systems like this rarely have any direct negative impact on a game. Ori is still great despite this unnecessary addition. However, it does signal a slightly worrying mentality to the subject of depth. Stuff like stat bonuses in a game that doesn't operate largely on the use and management of stats doesn't extend the depth of a game by any significant amount, yet they still find their way into a lot of modern games. Though they may not be bad by themselves, the implementation of such can in some cases lead to designers feeling as if they don't need to add as many substantial gameplay elements because there's a skill tree or whatever. Games only have so much time, money, and talent behind them, so the more of that spent on redundant bonuses which don't require the rest of the game to be designed with them in mind, the less of that is spent on meaningful developments to character movesets, enemy design, or level structure. Depth is something that requires a lot of thought during the making of a title. It's something that really requires a designer to get into the minds of their players and see what decisions they may try to make, and so adapting their player mechanics or obstacles to those potential choices. In a way, that's what depth is, the thought and decision making that someone can go through when playing a title, whether it be in a fraction of a second or over a good few minutes of planning. A fantastic narrative is always nice to have, as is good music, aesthetics, and sound design. But really, this is what games are about. I didn't make this video to pretend I know more about this than actual game designers, but rather because I feel that people don't talk about this stuff as often as they should. It's easy to talk about other aspects of a game because we're used to talking about them with other mediums. Music isn't intrinsic to games, neither is art design nor story, but hopefully people can start to dig into the real specifics of what makes certain games have such lasting appeal and stand the test of time. Because the more attention that's brought to it through critique or praise, the better games will get in the future.